This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 560 of the Late Round Podcast, with many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. FanDuel is giving new users an exclusive offer to play NFL Daily Fantasy for free all season long. All you have to do is sign up for FanDuel Daily Fantasy, and you'll receive one free voucher for each remaining week of the NFL season. You'll receive your voucher upon sign up to FanDuel Daily Fantasy, and vouchers will automatically apply to each weekly entry. Head over to FanDuel.com and sign up to play daily fantasy football. Eligibility restrictions apply. New users only. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. Add Kadarius Toney. So back in week 3 against the Falcons, we saw Sterling Shepard and Darius Slayton get injured. That allowed Kadarius Toney to see more work in the Giants' offense. In weeks 1 and 2, Toney's snap shares didn't even reach 30%. In week 3, that snap share number jumped to 66%. The next week, both wide receivers were out. So Toney played 78% of New York snaps. And like I mentioned on last week's show, because Kadarius Toney was an ad last week, he played the majority of his snaps in that week 4 game from the slot. According to Next Gen Stats, he played about 61% of his snaps from that area of the field. And he had a 6-catch, 78-yard performance. That all makes sense because Sterling Shepard's their slot guy, and Shepard was out, so Kadarius Toney took over. Shepard and Slayton were both out in week 5 as well against Dallas. And then Kenny Golladay ended up missing most of that game with a knee issue. That resulted in Kadarius Toney playing only 29% of his snaps from the slot. He saw 10 targets in that game against Dallas while playing on the outside, and he caught 8 of them for 150 yards. He had 189 total receiving yards on the day. So why am I bringing all this up? Because it shows versatility. Even if each of these wide receivers is healthy, rational coaching would keep Kadarius Toney on the field. He's probably not going to hit 189 receiving yards in a game again this year, but he's absolutely worth an ad this week if you passed on him a week ago. Buy A.J. Brown. Now look, let's walk through the A.J. Brown journey of 2021. A.J. Brown managers, you might want to earmuff this. In week 1, the Titans' offense was just a dumpster fire. But even still, on 8 targets, A.J. Brown was able to find the end zone. It was the best week of his fantasy season. In week 2, Brown had arguably the worst game of his entire career. He caught just 3 of 9 targets in a pass-friendly script. He was hurt early in week 3, and then he missed week 4. So weeks 3 and 4 don't really count. And then this past weekend, he only had 38 receiving yards against the Jags. So what does that tell you? It tells you that Brown managers are probably a little bit frustrated. And honestly, they should be. In each of his last 3 games, he scored fewer than 8 PPR points. He only did that once in 2020. But there is some reason for optimism. In the 3 games that A.J. Brown has finished this year, he's averaged a target share per game of 24.8%. That's only 2.5 percentage points lower than his average a season ago. And it's a good target share. A 25% target share is a good target share. And Tennessee continues to score touchdowns on the ground. Yeah, guys, I get it. They have Derrick Henry, and he is an absolute freak of nature. But their pass-to-rush touchdown ratio this season, how they're scoring their touchdowns, is 0.75. That's a bottom 5 ratio in the league. And it's a lot smaller than the team's season-long low under Mike Vrabel of 1.07. Their average pass-to-rush touchdown ratio over the last 3 seasons has been 1.24. And that's with a whole lot of Ryan Tannehill rushing touchdowns. Tannehill this season has scored only once on the ground. So to put this all another way, we should expect the Tennessee offense to score their touchdowns through the air at least a little bit more than they have so far this year. When you combine that with a solid target share, Brown's going to be fine. He should be fine. So it makes sense to buy low this week. Hold Myles Gaskin. So I have a little secret for you guys. I have Myles Gaskin in 1 fantasy league this year. I drafted him in 1 league. And it's in a league where I have Christian McCaffrey. Little did I know, by slotting Myles Gaskin into my starting lineup this past week, I would get Christian McCaffrey production against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And I understand, I'm one of few who actually started Myles Gaskin this past week. It was not a good matchup. And as someone who has Gaskin in that 1 league, I think there is going to be some unpredictability with Gaskin moving forward. He had a 10-target game in week 5. That's a good thing. He had almost 32 PPR points. I just don't think that what he did is that sustainable, like to that degree, even close to that degree. As we know, Tampa Bay is a tough team to run on. We've seen back-to-back opponents now barely even try. In week 4, New England ran the ball just 8 times against the Buccaneers. In week 5, Miami had 9 rush attempts. Now, of course, some of that can be credited to game script. But even in a neutral game script against the Bucs, the Dolphins had a 72% pass rate. Their neutral script pass rate entering the week was over 10 percentage points lower than that. And their week 5 matchup, they didn't have all their pass catchers. Devontae Parker and Will Fuller were both out. And they were still that pass heavy. This is all just another reason to believe that this 25.6% target share that Gaskin had in week 5, that it's not going to be easy to maintain. That's obvious though. Because you have to ask yourself, what happens if Devontae Parker and Will Fuller are healthy? Running backs don't just get 25% target shares week in and week out. So you're probably wondering, why not sell Myles Gaskin then? If we know he's not going to do this again this year, why not try to trade him away high? Why not get rid of Gaskin after this huge performance? Well, I don't think the market for Myles Gaskin is that strong. I would assume it's not that strong. We can't just sit here and assume that a manager's just going to ignore what happened during the first 4 weeks of the season where Gaskin averaged fewer than 8 PPR points per game. But here's the other thing. Gaskin did see a season-high 68.5% snap rate. What if his strong outing means that the Dolphins put him on the field more in the coming weeks? That seems rational. And over Miami's next 2 games, they get the Jaguars and the Falcons. Those are 2 bottom 7 teams in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. Those games set up a lot differently than the week 5 matchup against the Buccaneers. We should not expect the Dolphins to be as pass heavy against those teams as they were against the Bucs. That's going to lower the expectation for Myles Gaskin because what he did against Tampa Bay was almost entirely through the air. But if Gaskin's able to capture a similar snap share as to what he captured in week 5, he should be able to produce. I mean, I think all of us would look at that backfield and say that Myles Gaskin is the best running back that they have. So I don't think it's time to sell high because I don't think the market is really there. And there's at least something that we can latch onto as snap share and feel good about Gaskin moving forward. So he's not a buy because I do think this is somewhat fluky, but he's not a sell either. Add Devontae Booker. So Saquon Barkley has an ankle injury. And it wasn't even because of what he did on the field. I mean, he was on the field, but he stepped on a Cowboy defender's foot. And his ankle just started swelling up on the sideline. I'm sure a lot of you guys saw that. That naturally led to a bigger workload for Devontae Booker, their backup. Booker saw 16 of a possible 17 non-Saquon Barkley running back rushes against Dallas. And with all those pass catcher injuries that they have, he had an 11% target share as well. I mean, honestly, he saw Saquon Barkley type usage. Apparently, Barkley could be sidelined 2 to 4 weeks with this injury. That makes Booker a good add off the waiver wire. Drop Trey Sermon. So a few weeks ago on a mailbag episode, I tried to talk through this San Francisco backfield. I tried to just look at things logically. So let's do that once again. In week 1, Trey Sermon was a surprise inactive. And then Raheem Mostert got injured in that game. Elijah Mitchell then became the lead back. And then Mitchell was injured in week 2, which allowed Sermon to be the top back. And I would say that Sermon was mostly disappointing. He was the PPR RB26 and RB37 in his 2 games as starter without Elijah Mitchell. He was giving up a lot of pass catching work to Kyle Juszczyk. Well, Elijah Mitchell returned to the field in week 5, and guess what? He was the starter. This isn't that confusing. This is actually pretty straightforward. From week 1 until now, we kind of have a pretty good idea of how the San Francisco backfield works. They like Elijah Mitchell more than Trey Sermon. As long as Elijah Mitchell is healthy, Trey Sermon is not going to get that much work. That's what we saw in week 5 with Mitchell back. Mitchell had 9 carries, Trey Sermon had 1. Mitchell played 40 offensive snaps, Trey Sermon played 2. Literally every action that the 49ers have taken since the start of the regular season, let's just ignore the preseason for a second. Every action that they've taken has shown us that they don't really like Trey Sermon right now. Elijah Mitchell is the back that you want to own. So at this point, Trey Sermon is a handcuff. I mean, maybe his role grows as the season progresses. But with my eyes, what I'm seeing, Elijah Mitchell looks like a better running back than Trey Sermon. Let's forget any of our priors that we had. I mean, I've called Elijah Mitchell a Raheem Mostert clone, so I can understand why Kyle Shanahan likes him. But just because Trey Sermon had the better draft capital doesn't mean that he's automatically better. Elijah Mitchell has looked a lot better in this offense. So again, Trey Sermon is basically a handcuff. And given the fact that when he became the starter, when Elijah Mitchell was out, that he still didn't produce, that's when you know that he's not even a good handcuff. And that's why he can be dropped. Add Ramondre Stevenson. Damian Harris is now dealing with a ribs injury. He's also dealing with fumbling issues. We remember what happened in week 1. He fumbled the ball away. Miami was able to win that game against New England. This past week, he was at the goal line. He was about to score a touchdown, and he fumbled the ball once again. Those are two very, very big fumbles. Those are two fumbles that Bill Belichick might not like very much. So let's look at Ramondre Stevenson. He's a pretty well-rounded, big-bodied back. He was one of the biggest running backs that came out of this draft class. But one of the big things that I talked about on this show during the offseason is that his production profile was sneaky good. It wasn't totally complete, but in games that he played during his final collegiate season, he had a really good 15% reception share. He was a bigger-bodied back who was able to catch passes out of the backfield. You don't see that combination very often. That was the main reason that I was interested in Stevenson as a prospect. So I think because of this injury that Harris might be dealing with, it might not be that big of a deal, but we have this injury that he's dealing with, and then the fumbling issues. Those two things combined, it makes sense to add Ramondre Stevenson this week. Sell Kareem Hunt. Are you guys having deja vu? There was a really, really stupid fantasy analyst who sat on a podcast last week and said, hey, you guys should trade away Kareem Hunt. And then Kareem Hunt in week 5 scored almost 26 PPR points. As you guys know, that stupid fantasy analyst was me. Now, the idea in trading Kareem Hunt was not that he wasn't going to be relevant. I'm not that stupid. It's just that I viewed him more as a high-end RB2 rather than the RB1 that he was performing as. And I still kind of feel that way. Now, if the Browns participate in 90-point shootouts each week like they did in week 5, then yeah, Kareem Hunt's going to ball out. But there's no reason that we should assume that's going to happen. And that means that regression is eventually going to come for Kareem Hunt. Hunt now has 5 rushing touchdowns when Cleveland scored a total of 16 times on offense this year. His rushing touchdowns then have accounted for 31.3% of the Browns' overall touchdowns. So that's Kareem Hunt rushing touchdowns divided by Browns' total offensive touchdowns. Since 2011, that type of touchdown share has been hit just 21 times. So like twice per season. When looking at that sample of 21 running backs, the average running back rush share among that group was about 73%. The average rush attempts per game of that group was a little over 18. This all makes sense. Running backs who see a lot of volume in an offense, they're going to be able to capture a larger share of an offense's touchdowns. Volume equals touchdowns. This season, Kareem Hunt has a running back rush share of 36.9%. That's basically half of what we've seen from that sample of 21 running backs. He's averaging 11 rush attempts per game. Again, the average among that sample was 18 rush attempts per game. And then all the while, even though that number got higher in week 5, the Browns are still scoring their touchdowns in a pretty strange way. Their .33 pass to rush touchdown ratio is tied with Chicago for the lowest in the league. Over the last decade, no team has finished a season with a pass to rush touchdown ratio below .59. I think there's this idea that Kareem Hunt is seeing all of the goal line work in the Browns offense. That's not true. He has 4 goal line rushes this season. That number has been matched or exceeded by 17 running backs. And one of those players that has exceeded that number is Nick Chubb. Nick Chubb has 6 goal line rushes. Kareem Hunt has 4. It's just that Chubb has converted only 1 of them. Kareem Hunt has converted 3 of them. Kareem Hunt is a very, very, very good running back. He's going to be efficient, especially in that offense. That offense is favorable for running backs. And Kareem Hunt has a 15% target share. That's top 5 of the position. This is why he's not going to disappear. The idea was never that he was going to disappear. He's just not going to keep up this pace, more than likely. Now, Hunt has upside with an injury to Nick Chubb. So you've got to price that into any sort of trade. But to me, Hunt is more of a mid-range to high-end RB2 in fantasy rather than this full-blown RB1. The way I see it, I think that a guy like Darrell Henderson is a better rest-of-season running back than Kareem Hunt is. Whereas I don't think everyone agrees with that. touchdown regression is eventually going to hit. He's still a good running back. You still want him on your fantasy roster, but touchdown regression will eventually hit. Add Khalil Herbert. In Chicago's first full game without David Montgomery this season, we saw more of a split backfield than probably most of us expected. Now, Damian Williams had the valuable looks in that offense. That's what matters the most. He had 47% of the team's running back rushes, but he had a 15% target share, and he saw goal line work. He had 3 goal line rushes against the Raiders. But rookie Khalil Herbert was involved. He had 18 carries versus Williams' 16. Now, a lot of that did have to do with game script. Khalil Herbert's going to see more work in this offense more than likely when Chicago's leading. But even still, during the first half of that game against the Raiders, Herbert had 7 rushes, Damian Williams had 11. So I think that he could have flex appeal during this bye week period. And he's got handcuff upside now as well. Buy Zach Moss. Zach Moss has had a pretty interesting journey this season. He was inactive in week 1 against the Steelers, but he's seen his usage get better and better each and every week. In week 2, his first game of the season, he played just 28% of Buffalo's snaps. But that number jumped to 56% in both weeks 3 and 4. And then on Sunday night, we saw Moss reach a 74% snap share. And that increase in snaps correlated with an increase in touches. Moss had seen about half of the team's running back rushes over the 2 weeks before week 5. But in week 5, his running back rush share jumped to almost 65%. His target share was 16.7%. Moss has slowly but surely become the 1A in the Buffalo Bills backfield. And I'm bullish in the short term. Over the next 5 weeks, no team has a better running back schedule than the Bills do. They get Tennessee in week 6, a team that ranks in the bottom half of the league in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. They get a bye in week 7, and then they get the Dolphins, Jags, and Jets. Each of those teams rank in the bottom 7 in the league in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. So if Moss's current usage holds, he could be a locked-in RB2 during this 4-game stretch. Add Ricky Seals-Jones. So Logan Thomas was put on IR last week, and the initial timeline was that he'd be sidelined for about 4 weeks. So in week 5, Ricky Seals-Jones was the starter for Washington. And he did really well. He saw 20% of Washington's targets. That turned into 5 catches for 41 yards. His target share was higher than any share that Logan Thomas had seen all season long. And Seals-Jones was essentially used like any other wide receiver on that team. According to Pro Football Focus, he had 42 routes run. That was second most on Washington this past week, behind only Terry McLaurin, who had 1 more. That's really good usage, and that makes him a near plug-and-play option at a weak fantasy position until Logan Thomas gets better. Add Dan Arnold. So Dan Arnold played his second game with the Jags on Sunday. He had a 24% target share in that game. His first game with the team saw a pretty big split in routes run at the tight end position. Arnold ran 11 routes, Chris Manhertz had 7, Luke Farrell had 4, and Jacob Hollister had 4. That's all according to Pro Football Focus. Arnold saw that routes run number jump to 30 in week 5. Hollister was second on the team with only 8 routes run. This could mean fantasy football viability moving forward. Jacksonville's been forced to be a pretty pass-heavy team because of game script this year. They rank in the top half of the league in both pass rate and total pass attempts. And they've been slightly above average in tight end target share, even though they haven't had really good tight ends to throw to. So I think Dan Arnold makes sense. I like Ricky Seals-Jones a little bit more, but don't forget about Arnold off the waiver wire this week. Buy Rondale Moore. So by no means was week 5 a bad one for Rondale Moore. He had 6 targets, he caught 5 of them for 59 yards, and he had an additional 38 yards on the ground. So this isn't exactly like a buy low moment. But I do think it's an interesting time to go buy Rondale Moore. For the first time this season, Moore ran more routes than Christian Kirk. He still wasn't on the field in 2 wide receiver sets. That was still AJ Green, who ran 10 more routes. But from weeks 1 through 4, Kirk had run 113 routes versus Moore's 67. On Sunday, it was 20-18 in favor of the rookie. And now you have Max Williams, who suffered a significant knee injury. That could lead to more volume for the other pass catchers in this Arizona offense. So Rondale Moore is trending up from a usage standpoint. And he's also a rookie that will naturally progress. So I think he's a really good player to target in hopes that he has a monster second half of the season. Add Darrell Williams. So Clyde Edwards-Helaire suffered an MCL sprain on Sunday night against the Bills. He's expected to be out a few weeks. Now without CEH, we should expect Darrell Williams to be the dude in that backfield. In a negative game script against the Bills, Williams played the most snaps for Kansas City, and he out-targeted backup Jerick McKinnon 5-2 while seeing the most work on the ground. McKinnon isn't a terrible add in deeper leagues, but Williams needs to be the priority. Add Taylor Heineke. Week 5 was the first time this season since Taylor Heineke has become a starter where he didn't finish as a top 12 quarterback in fantasy football. He's been that good. And the fact is, New Orleans has been good against quarterbacks. They rank 4th best in adjusted points allowed to the position. We could see a serious bounce-back game from Heineke in Week 6. The football team gets the Chiefs. According to FanDuel Sportsbook, there's a 54.5 point over-under in that game. Kansas City has now surrendered 4 straight top 5 quarterback performances. And even though those games have been against good quarterbacks, when you adjust for schedule, they're still a bottom 5 defense in points allowed to the position. So I like Taylor Heineke a lot as a streamer this week. Add the Cincinnati Bengals defense. So the Bengals defense has really only had one game where they played well below expectation defensively this year, and it was against the Jags in Week 4, obviously when everyone was streaming them. This week, though, they have a good matchup against the Lions. Cincinnati's a 3.5 point road favorite, and Detroit's been a top 10 opponent for defenses when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. The 16th transaction this week that you can't get in my 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com is to hold Aaron Jones. People are freaking out. Aaron Jones hasn't really had a monster performance since Week 2 when he scored almost 42 fantasy points. And then all the while, A.J. Dillon has finished as the RB30 and the RB18 over the last 2 weeks in PPR formats. I get it, it's a little bit scary. But consider this. From Week 2 through Week 5, Aaron Jones' snap share has been between 63% and 73% in every single contest. A.J. Dillon's snap shares have been between 28% and 32%. In one of those games in there, though, he did hit a 40% snap share in a positive game script against Pittsburgh. So from a snap share perspective, not a whole lot has changed. Now, I know A.J. Dillon had an 11% target share in Week 5. But again, don't panic. It was by far the highest of his season, and it's likely just somewhat of an outlier. Dillon only ran 10 routes against the Bengals. Aaron Jones ran 29. That's actually a wider gap than what we'd seen from any other week this season. Jones still has 4 goal line rushes to Dillon's 1 this year, and he has 2 goal line targets to Dillon's 0. I'm using this time to let you know that it's not time to panic with Aaron Jones. A.J. Dillon's market share numbers might have looked slightly different this past week, but how Green Bay utilized him really wasn't different. Aaron Jones will be just fine, and A.J. Dillon is still a flex option for more desperate teams who also serves as a handcuff. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow.